What's up, everybody? I'm back to do the horoscopes for Cancer and Cancer Rising for the month of February of 2019. So this is an experiment. I'm doing a live stream for this set of horoscopes this month where I'm going through each of the signs and I'm streaming it out to Twitter and Facebook and YouTube live at the same time. So it's a bit of an experiment. Thanks everybody for joining me if you're joining the live chat. If you're watching the recording, thank you for watching as well. Let's jump right into it. So first I wanted to look at the calendar for, this is called the Planetary Alignments calendar. It shows the ingresses of the planets and the specific dates when they go into different signs during the course of the month. It also shows the two lunations, which is the new moon in Aquarius on the 4th of February and the full moon in Virgo on the 19th of February. I also have a planetary movements calendar, which shows where the planets start off at the beginning of the month and where they will end up by the end of the month, which is kind of useful because it shows you not just what signs and what whole sign houses the planets are moving through, but also shows you the relative speeds of the different planets, with some of them moving very quickly through the signs during the course of the month and others moving more slowly. All right, so the main chart, though, that I really wanted to focus on is the solar fire chart, where I'm running the program Solar Fire and I'm animating the chart to look at the major transits that are coming up during the course of this month, so we can actually pinpoint specific dates and look at the actual alignment of the planets at different times during the course of February. I have the chart set to Cancer Rising since, for the purpose of my horoscopes, I'm primarily talking about those of you who have your ascendant in Cancer, although you can also look at my horoscopes from the perspective of your sun sign, especially if you were born during the day with the sun in Cancer, or your moon sign, especially if you're born at night with the sun in Cancer. All right, so, and for those of you who are joining me in the live chat, either on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, if you have any questions as I go along, please just post them in the chat, and I will try to get back to you at some point when I can. All right, so here's the chart with the ascendant in Cancer. This month we're not very much focused on outer planet transits because there's not a lot of major outer planet like sign changes or stations, either retrograde or direct. So it's not a very heavy month for outer planet transits for the most part. Those are still going on, and for some of you, if they're hitting natal planets this month, that's going to be particularly important. But I've talked about some of the long-term outer planet transits before in previous months' horoscopes, so I don't want to dwell on them too much this month. Instead, I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the inner planet transits. The first one of which that I wanted to talk about is Venus. So Venus here we can see on February 1st starts off at 27 degrees of Sagittarius. So Venus is coming off of that very nice Venus-Jupiter conjunction that we had in mid-Sagittarius earlier in January, or middle of January, on January 22nd. And Venus very quickly in February, by about February 3rd, February 4th, it leaves Sagittarius and your 6th whole sign house, and it moves into Capricorn, which is your 7th house of relationships for those of you with Cancer rising. So this is actually a pretty positive transit, especially for those of you with night charts, because the Cancer rising people over the past year or so are pretty much right in the middle or right in the thick of a pretty long-term 2 or 3 year Saturn transit, with Saturn going through your 7th house of relationships, which can sometimes be a little bit more challenging time for relationships in different ways, or challenging times in terms of partnership. And Venus moving into your 7th house this month for the entirety of February should bring some alleviation to that transit to some extent this month. That's true especially for those of you with night charts who were born with the sun in the bottom half of your chart, anywhere below the ascendant-descendant axis. That makes it a night chart. So Venus ingresses into Capricorn February 3rd, February 4th, and then it moves through that sign for pretty much the entirety of February, and it doesn't leave the sign and move into Aquarius until the beginning of March, I believe. So during the course of that transit, it's actually going to conjoin some of those Capricorn planets. Like, for example, it conjoins transiting Saturn at 16 degrees of Capricorn around February 17th. It then conjoins transiting Pluto around February 22nd or 23rd. And then eventually, just before it leaves Capricorn, it squares Uranus from 29 Capricorn to 29 Aries. And then the month is pretty much over and Venus goes into Aquarius. So this month for you is very much characterized by this Venus transit. My general interpretation of that for the most part is just it's a positive or auspicious transit for relationships. Venus likes to unify and likes to reconcile things. So sometimes the unifying function of Venus can bring people together, and it can bring a relationship or a person into your life if there isn't one already. In other instances, if there's been problems in relationships or you've had a falling out with somebody or things have been rocky, Venus coming in can reconcile you and can help you to smooth out some of the difficulties that you've been having in the recent past. So for the most part, this is a pretty positive transit, and it's something definitely to look forward to in terms of relationships. So it primarily pertains to romantic relationships, but the 7th house is also direct one-on-one relationships with other people in your life as well. So that can be things like business relationships if you have a business partner, and other just general one-on-one type of direct relationships as well could be connected to this transit. It could be positive for smoothing things over or forming new one-on-one relationships with people in your life in general. So that's one major transit going on this month that I wanted to focus on. The other major interplanet transit that's really localized to this month is the Mars transit, where in the first half of the month, Mars starts out the month moving through Aries, and it's completing the later part of its transit through your 10th house of career. So I talked about this a lot in the horoscopes for last month, so I don't want to dwell on that part of the transit for too long, but Mars through the 10th can either bring a lot of excess energy to matters pertaining to your career, so you're having to focus on and put a lot more energy towards your career than normal, or in some instances it can bring conflict or a strife or a sort of separation in terms of your career if it's working out in a more problematic fashion, especially for those of you who have day charts or those of you where Mars or the 10th house is actually activated this year as a Time Lord. So that transit actually culminates right towards the end of Mars's trip through Aries when it conjoins Uranus at 29 degrees of that sign. So that happens around February 12th, February 13th. We get that conjunction of Mars and Uranus in your 10th house. That's kind of an explosive transit. It's kind of an unexpected or sometimes disruptive transit. For some of you, this is the tail end of a pretty long-term, like 7 or 8 year Uranus transit through your 10th house. So it's like the final hurrah or the final fireworks before Uranus departs from your 10th house as you're sort of taking stock of or learning what the lesson was of that transit through your 10th over the course of the greater part of the last decade. So for Uranus transits, they tend to be about major unexpected changes and sometimes disruptions, but other times sort of constructive revolutions which break down certain structures in your life. In your instance, it would be in the context of your career and your overall life direction, but then they allow you, by clearing those things out, to build them up in a new and innovative way that you wouldn't have imagined previously. So you're coming out of the tail end of that at this point. For most of you, that transit and whatever it was about is largely over. But for some of you, if you have close natal planets around 29 degrees of Aries or 29 degrees of the cardinal signs, there may be one last event that has to happen to shake things up before you can move in cleanly to not just Mars going into Taurus, which happens on February 14th, but also eventually Uranus going into Taurus, which is going to happen next month in March. So I'm going to focus more on that Uranus into Taurus transit next month, since that's one of the major features of March, and I don't want to use up all material for next month prematurely. But one thing I did want to talk about is that Mars ingress into Taurus, because even though the first half of the month is characterized by Mars going through your 10th house of career, the second half of the month is really characterized by Mars moving into Taurus and going into your 11th house of friends. So Mars going through the 11th house of friends, like all Mars transits, it has that dual sort of focus or dual possibilities, where on the one hand, sometimes it's just having a greater amount of energy and having to put a greater amount of focus on that area of your life. So maybe there's something going on with your friends that you need to spend more time with your friends, and you become more active in terms of your social life during the second half of February. Other people might get involved in groups and might have to put in more work into groups, and it might be strenuous or something that's tiring because you're having to put so much focus into it, but ultimately it's constructive. For those of you, especially with night charts, I would expect that to be more of the case. The other end of the spectrum with Mars is that sometimes Mars transiting through a house like the 11th can lead to strife or conflict with friends. Some of that energy that you have to put into the 11th house can sometimes overflow and sometimes lead to things like irritation or impulsiveness, like being impulsive with friends, or sometimes having like a severing or a separation of a friendship is a potential for Mars going through the 11th house. So sometimes that's necessary, and sometimes that's something that has to occur, especially if there's some issue going on with friends where they're not playing a productive role in your life, or somehow friendships are dragging you down. Sometimes that can be necessary to sort of remove yourself from the situation and have to have that separation. And that's going to be really up to you on a case-by-case basis if that's actually what's going on, if you find yourself in that situation. In other instances, you might want to be careful, because if you don't want to have like a major long-term falling out with a friend, or if it's just over some minor dispute that shouldn't turn into a major thing, you want to be careful not to do anything too impulsively, because it could lead to a more long-term separation than you might anticipate at the time. So the basic advice is just be careful with friends this month. Don't do anything impulsive or overly brash that you might regret in retrospect. All right, so those are the two main inner planet transits that I wanted to mention this month. Let me see if there's any questions so far. And I'm going to primarily focus on questions from people that have Cancer rising, since this is the primary thing I'm talking about here. So it looks like somebody says their MC is in Cancer. Does this apply? No, this is primarily for people that have Cancer rising, so their ascendant in Cancer. Somebody says if they're in an 11th house Taurus perfection year, would the Venus transit be highlighted more than usual, or only natal Venus? Yeah, that's it's true. Both are true, actually. So if somebody is in a Taurus perfection year, or a Libra perfection year for that matter, then that means that Venus is activated not just in its natal position, but also in its transits. So that means transits like this of Venus going through the 7th house are going to be more important and are going to be more likely to coincide with actual events or actual developments and changes in your life compared to other times or compared to other transits. So if people want more information about that, they can just do a search for annual perfections on YouTube, and you'll find a couple of videos that I've done on the topic so far. Let's see. Other questions so far? Yeah, I'm trying to marathon the horoscopes tonight. I'm not sure how far I'll get. Ray Angelo says he's going to catch up on Sagittarius and Capricorn. It looks like we've got a while before we get there, but I'll hopefully make it there tonight. We'll see what happens. Somebody, Nicholas Cannon, asks, would you say Mars opposing the 5th house might affect affairs of that house negatively? It doesn't have to, unless there's also like a natal planet in the 5th house. It would be opposing that natal planet, in which case, yeah, that could negatively affect affairs of the 5th house potentially. Somebody asked, what is the most auspicious day and time in February for Cancer rising? That's a bit of a, I would have to specify that, I think, for the individual in the actual natal chart. I don't think I could give a good answer for that otherwise. Somebody asked about Time Lords. Just do a search for my video on annual perfections, and you'll find my video about how to find the Lord of the Year. And that's really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Time Lords. Okay, and I can't repeat at the moment, but there will be a replay of this later. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the other transits. If you guys have questions, just post them in the chat, and I will get back to you later on in the stream. All right, so let's switch back over to, I've done the Venus transit through the 7th house of relationship. I've talked about Mars going through your 10th house of career and then into your 11th house of friendship. The other thing I needed to mention was the lunations this month. So it looks like we can see from the planetary movements calendar that there's a new moon in Aquarius in your 8th house of shared resources, and there's a full moon in Virgo in your 3rd house of communication. So a new moon, of course, is always setting the foundation for something new that's going to begin slowly and subtly in your life when it comes to shared resources. So this can be things like the money between you and that's shared with a partner. Sometimes it's about your partner's resources in general. Other times it can have to do with things like taxes. Like I know a lot of people are going to be paying taxes this year. Other 8th house topics are things like loans. So the idea with a new moon is just starting a new phase in that area of your life. Or if there's something that you could do differently that you'd like to see done differently in that area of your life, this would be a good time to initiate that. So this is not something that is going to have an immediate payoff, and it's not something you should do with the expectation that it's going to immediately be successful, but instead it's a good time to initiate something that will grow and develop in the long term, especially over the course of the next 6 months. And then eventually you'll get a full moon in that house, and you'll see whatever you initiate at this time coming to fruition about 6 months later. So those are some of the topics with that new moon in the 8th house, and that's happening on February 4th is when that new moon takes place in Aquarius. The other lunation this month is a full moon in Virgo in the 3rd house of communication, education, short distance travel, and siblings. So all of those topics are potential targets for the new moon, and the full moon. And a full moon represents a culmination of events or something coming to maturity that you initiated previously in your life, or that was a new development that was initiated previously in your life, especially 6 months earlier. So it may be something with, since the 3rd house is the place of communication, it may be something with respect to the way that you talk or the way that you present yourself and communicate to other people, which was a minor or a small development several months ago, but now it's actually starting to take hold and to become part of your personality in a way that you're becoming more successful in communicating what you know. The 3rd house is always kind of tied together with the 9th house, where the 9th house is the place, really the primary place of higher education, and the 3rd house is the house of how you communicate what you know. And at this time, what we have is there's something about the way that you communicate what you know that's becoming more mature and that has reached a new level compared to how you were doing it previously. So this doesn't necessarily have to be a major transit, but it's just one of those lunations to pay attention to as a sort of successive development in that area of your life. Let me pull it up on the actual transit chart. So there it is around February 19th. We see that full moon in Virgo right at the beginning of the sign in your 3rd house. For some of you as siblings, the culmination of events could be happening with respect to your relationship with your siblings, or some development in your siblings' life that becomes notable at this time. The 3rd house can also have to do with relatives or short distance travel or other things like that. So relatively somewhat minor or somewhat mundane affairs. So those are the 2 lunations. The only other thing I meant to mention in terms of interplanet transits this month is we are getting ready for a Mercury retrograde, and the later part of February really starts ramping up to that in a significant way because Mercury enters its shadow. And what happens is that in early March, Mercury stations retrograde at 29 degrees of Pisces, and it's going to retrograde all the way back until like 15 or 16 degrees of Pisces, where it's going to conjoin Neptune in March. And I'm getting a little ahead of myself in terms of, getting into the forecast for March, but I wanted to mention it just because some of the events and themes surrounding the Mercury retrograde period are already going to be put in place or going to line themselves up in the last, like the second half of February or something like that. starting with the Mercury-Neptune conjunction that takes place around February 18th or February 19th. So since this is happening in your 9th house, it may have to do with education, it may have to do with travel. There's a good chance it will have something to do with your beliefs or the things that you believe about the world. One of the things you want to be careful about is that Mercury-Neptune conjunctions can sometimes coincide with communication that is like the opposite of clear, that is not clear, or communication where there's some sort of crossed wire and the message doesn't get conveyed clearly or accurately. So you want to make sure during this time in the lead up to this, especially with Mercury occurring in your 9th house of education, that you're sort of being careful about the sources of information and knowledge that you're taking in, because there's the potential that perhaps with Mercury conjoining Neptune in your 9th house, going retrograde and coming back and conjoining it again, that there could not only be miscommunication when it comes to education, but that you could learn something that may not necessarily be true. So I would just be careful to stay grounded and stay realistic about things in terms of that transit, because that transit, especially in March, not so much in February, but especially in March, makes me a little nervous seeing a Mercury retrograde that is that closely tied up with Neptune. All right, so those are most of the major interplanet transits this month for Cancer rising, and that's, like I said, I don't want to focus too much on the outer planet transits because I've done that a lot during previous months. Does anybody have any questions now that we're getting towards the end of this? So somebody says, Amelia on Facebook says, if a transiting planet that is highlighted by perfection year is making a conjunction to that same planet, how would the condition of the planet be activated? For example, in a Virgo perfection year with natal Mercury in Pisces. So you're asking, so your example is you're in a Virgo perfection year, Mercury is activated and it's natally in Pisces, and therefore it's going to get activated by that Mercury retrograde transit. I would just say I would be extra careful about that Mercury retrograde and some of the typical Mercury retrograde type things, that the sort of like cliche Mercury retrograde type things, because you're going to be more susceptible to those during that time period. And this is because when a planet is activated by annual perfections, as I said earlier, it's activated not just in its natal position, but also in its transits. So that's really emphasizing that one for you then at that time. And this is the reason why, you know, sometimes we really get nailed by a Mercury retrograde and all of the cliche things happen. Like there's a delay, or there's miscommunication, or you have like a missed appointment, and other things like that. The times in which that tends to happen and become a really cliche Mercury retrograde type thing tend to be the years when Mercury is activated in that way as a Time Lord through something like annual perfections, versus the Mercury retrogrades where Mercury is not activated as a Time Lord. Those tend to be the ones that come and go without that much happening, or with it happening in a much more minor or like reduced fashion than normal. So I would just say, to answer that question, that it's like the potential for that being more readily like a Mercury retrograde period, and some of the classic Mercury retrograde type things is heightened for you in that instance. Let's see, other questions that are going on so far in the chat. So I'm seeing some of this, but I'm not sure if some of it's relevant to the Cancer rising specifically, so I want to focus on that. Okay. Yeah, so this will be, the replay of this will be available immediately on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube as soon as it's done playing. So even if you came into the broadcast late. All right, guys. So I'm looking to see if there's anything else that I wanted to touch on in terms of the planetary alignments for this month, but I think really that's it. I mean, we've got some major stuff coming up next month when Uranus changes signs and moves into Taurus. That's going to be a big shift and moves into your 11th house of friends and alliances and groups. You had a preview of that last year around May when Uranus first ingressed into Taurus and like dipped into that sign for a few months before retrograding back out into Aries. So that's going to be a huge shift in March, but that's something to sort of put off the fuller discussion of that until next month. Jupiter's also getting somewhat close. It's like a month away from stationing retrograde in Sagittarius, so that's going to be a big deal later in March or early in April. But otherwise, that's pretty much it. So I think that's it for your horoscope for February of 2019 for Cancer and Cancer rising. Any other final questions from the chat before I wrap this thing up? Somebody says, so a new moon in Aquarius in the 8th house would be a good time to start the process of getting a loan. Like, yeah, that's actually a pretty good manifestation of something like that. So whether it would be successful or not successful is partially going to be really tied into your natal chart and what the natal placements are that would be tied into that. But, you know, initiating something new that has to do with the 8th house would be a very good manifestation of having a new moon in that house at that time. So yeah, that would be a pretty good example. All right, so some of the other questions are a little bit more complicated than I can get to today, but I'll probably do another live stream soon just to do a general Q&A. So in the meantime, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/theastrologyschool. You can also subscribe to me on Twitter, which is Chris Brennan 7 on Twitter, and otherwise just find me at theastrologypodcast.com, and also my consulting website, which is chrisbrennanastrologer.com. All right, guys, I think that's it for the horoscope for Cancer and Cancer rising for February of 2019. Thanks a lot for joining me today. Thanks for watching this video, and everybody in the chat who watched the live stream. This is an experiment, but it's going well enough, and I'm going to keep pushing through the rest of the signs tonight, hopefully, and see how far I can get. So thanks a lot for watching. Good luck this month, and I'll see you again next time.